everybody, what's going on? And welcome to Guns N' Roses Central. And it's a very special day today. Now, this article you see is actually from a year ago, so it should say 31 years ago Guns N' Roses signed to Geffen Records. So I want to talk a bit about the history of the band, talk about what was going on when Guns N' Roses got signed, what they did with their cash advance, and some of the crazy stories that ensued during the year that Guns N' Roses basically just had to sit and do nothing before they went and made Appetite. And then we've also got some news this week that legendary label Geffen Records is going to be relaunching after disappearing. So back in the 90s, Geffen reportedly sold his label to Universal for about $800 million. And, David Geffen sort of he's out of the picture these days. But the name Geffen still stands as part of Interscope. And I'm kind of curious to see what's going to lie ahead for Geffen Records now that it's coming back. So let's get started with our look back at Guns N' Roses getting signed by Geffen Records back in 1986. So Tom Zutaut was interviewed by UPROXX a couple of years ago, and they talked about the story about how Guns N' Roses broke MTV. And, before the story of how they actually got on MTV, Tom Zutaut talked about how he actually discovered the band. So he went to one of their gigs. There was like a bunch of other record executives and A&R people just, at the same gig, just trying to see what this band Guns N' Roses was all about. And he said he was just amazed by Axl's energy and his performance and was just mesmerized by Slash's guitar playing. Like the kid was only 19 at the time. And he sort of compared them to Led Zeppelin. And, he said he only watched a couple songs and left, and it's sort of like in a ploy to trick the other record people who were there to make them think that, okay, Tom wasn't really impressed with them, so he just walked out of the gig. And what he was really doing was he'd only seen about 2 songs. He didn't even finish the second song. He was so impressed with them, he basically went home. The next day he went to David Geffen's office, talked to David Geffen, and just said he had seen the next biggest band. He thought Guns N' Roses was going to be bigger than Led Zeppelin and the Rolling Stones combined. He thought they would sell out stadiums, and he tried to convince David Geffen to actually make an offer to the band. So in March of 1986, Geffen Records actually offered $75,000 to Guns N' Roses to actually sign with Geffen Records. And, of course, in the end, they ended up doing it. But according to Slash, he said that around that time, they were getting wined and dined by a bunch of different record companies. I think Elektra Records was one of them, and there was a handful of other ones. And, they were sort of taking advantage of all the attention because they were dirt poor, and every time they'd go meet the record companies, they'd basically get taken out to dinner or for meals, and they were basically doing it just to get free meals. They knew at the end of the day they were going to sign with Geffen, but they just wanted to get some free meals and take advantage of the record companies. Now, according to Slash's biography, and even when Slash was on Howard Stern's show back in 2007, he talked about blowing most of his advance money, which was around $7,500 to $10,000, on heroin. Now, Slash wasn't the only member to spend his money on these kinds of things. Now, the next couple of things that Guns N' Roses had to do before recording an album was to find a place to live. They didn't really have their own place. And number 2, they needed to find a manager. So according to Tom Zutaut, he talked to every management company that he knew, and every management company he knew at the time turned them down. A lot of management companies looked at Guns N' Roses. They felt they were unmanageable because they believed the myth that they were all strung out on heroin and they were unproductive and they would never get into the studio. Now, finding a good manager was proving to be quite difficult. Randy Phillips, who now runs AEG Live, and Arnold Stiefel, who's best known for managing Rod Stewart, gave managing Guns N' Roses a shot before fleeing from the band. Now, for a short period of time, Arnold Stiefel actually helped manage Guns N' Roses with Tom Zutaut, but it was really one event that caused him to change his mind. And what had happened was Guns N' Roses had been put up in a rented house on the former estate of Cecile B. DeMille, and the landlord summoned Tom Zutaut and then manager Arnold Stiefel to the ravaged property one day. I almost fainted, recalled Stiefel, whose name was on the lease at the time. It was beneath the Planet of the Apes. It was beyond the Valley of the Dolls. It was so beyond imagining I couldn't stop laughing. So the band had torn the toilets from the floor and thrown them out the window. The scene inside was worse, recalled Zutaut. People were defecating in the sinks. The holes in the floor where the toilets got ripped off were filled with urine. There were half-eaten Whoppers with mold on the wrappers. They would just get in these drug rages and go berserk, Zutaut said. And of course, Zutaut had made his name signing the famously decadent Motley Crue. but he said this was worse than anything he'd seen before. So the damage totaled $22,000, and Stifle and his partner Randy Phillips submitted it to Geffen Records and then dropped Guns N' Roses as their clients. Now, amid all the madness that was going on in this house, there was one room that was actually left untouched amid all the chaos. There was this padlocked door, Zutta recalls. You go inside and there was Axl in this immaculate, perfect room surrounded by all the squalor. This was the dichotomy of Guns N' Roses. Rose was less interested in drugs and alcohol than his bandmates, but he had his own problems, of course. He was diagnosed as manic depressive, and his associates sometimes wondered whether he actually had multiple personality disorder. So Tom Zutta was desperate. You know, every management company had turned him down. The Guns N' Roses' last manager had basically walked away. So he reached out to an old friend of his named Alan Niven, who's from New Zealand, and he was managing a band at that time called Great White. They were one of these hair metal bands, and they were doing pretty good. And he actually helped write some of their songs as well. And him and Tom Zutta sort of go way back. Both of them actually discovered Motley Crue, and Tom Zutta was one of the guys who signed Metallica or helped discover Metallica as well. So they actually had some initial discussions about having Alan Niven manage Guns N' Roses. Now, although their first discussion was unproductive, Tom was able to convince Alan Niven to basically check out the band. So he basically laid it entirely on the line, Niven recalls. He said, "Niv, this could be the end of my career. This is shaping up to be a total disaster. Can you please help?" And since they were both friends, Alan Niven said, "Okay, I'll go and talk to them." So he went to see a couple shows, and then he went to the Troubadour and started talking with them and realized there was some intelligence behind the guys in Guns N' Roses. And then he recalled going to Pasha Studios where they were doing some demos, and at that point, Alan Niven got really intrigued. So Niven realized that not only were Guns N' Roses authentically rock and roll in the tradition of his favorite bands, true to themselves before anyone else, they had great chemistry and an undeniable musical groove when they locked in. And he talked about how Duff and Izzy really had this cool body language, and they were holding themselves on stage and playing together in such a way that he went, "Oh, hello, this is not half bad." And it really wasn't until he spent more time with their demo tapes and mixing that he began to realize that Slash was somebody who might really, really be a good player. And of course, Axl's voice was extraordinary. So his perception was if he could hold this band together, if he can get, them balanced and with their spontaneity, they could become a really good underground rock and roll band. So he stepped on board. And, he realized at first that America had sort of grown lukewarm about bombastic rock, and England was embracing showmanship and antics. So both Tom Zutta and Alan Niven convinced the executives at Geffen to actually put the band in the studio and record what would later be called Live Like a Suicide. So it was basically pressed, and it was shipped off to a bunch of journalists in England, and it would later be, of course, internationally released as the multi-platinum Lies with the additional tracks Patience, I Used to Love Her, You're Crazy, and of course the controversial song One in a Million. Now, when Appetite for Destruction was released back in 1987, it wasn't a huge success, initially at least. The album lingered for almost a year before it really caught fire, and the album's first single in the US was Welcome to the Jungle. They also shot a video for it, of course, and MTV refused to actually play the video. MTV was owned by one of these conservative, Christian, family values people who said they'll never play Guns N' Roses on MTV. And it wasn't until Geffen founder David Geffen was actually asked to lend his support to the band. So he called up MTV executives and convinced them to play Welcome to the Jungle during the network's after-hours rotation. So eventually the MTV executives agreed, and initially Welcome to the Jungle was only played once at 4 a.m. on a Sunday. It was 4 a.m. in New York City time. And even though the song was only initially going to be played once, hard rock fans took notice and soon began requesting the video in mass numbers. And eventually the actual video was added to MTV's rotation. Now, I don't want to talk too much more about Guns N' Roses in this video because I feel like I'm getting into true story territory where I could just be devoting a lot of that time to a true story about Appetite for Destruction. And maybe that's a story for another time. So I'm going to end the video here. I want to know your thoughts, guys. Comment down below. Did you know it was the 31st anniversary of Guns N' Roses signing with Geffen Records? Comment down below and make sure you hit the subscribe button to stay up to date on the latest Guns N' Roses news. And be sure to follow me on social media. The links to my Facebook and Twitter are down below in the description box. Thanks for watching, guys, and have yourself a good weekend.